All right. So it's what, day 3-ish? Sure. Post lunch. So you are going to be the most attentive audience ever. That'll be fine. What could go wrong? Thank you, everybody, for coming. I'm Ian. It's usually my fault, and it's typically my fault at Weave Identity, which is my company. There is an enormous amount of great content at Identiverse this year. There's an enormous amount of great content on right now. And so I really appreciate you actually spending time here. If you saw me on Tuesday, I talked about standing on the shoulder of giants and talking about how our industry is additive. I got to thank these people for helping build this deck over the course of decades, most of whom I've never talked to about this topic. I have never shown them a draft, but they've all added to this concept that I've been working on for a while. So I have to thank them. Let's get the bad news out of the way first. What have I told you? That despite decades of work by our industry, myself very much included, we actually haven't achieved that much. We struggle with access governance and access management. We struggle to bridge the gaps with our security peers and our developer peers. Now, if I was to tell you this, I'm not saying that I am, but if I was to tell you this, you're gonna at least partially react with like, come on, Ian. Like, look at all these standards that we invented and reinvented. Look at all of these products that manifest those standards. And if we're being honest, let's look at the billions that have been invested in and spent on identity. And of course, you'd be correct. But we still have challenges in what we do. We still do have things that we need to figure out how to do better, and that continues to be a challenge. And when I think about how to sum up the challenge that we have, I've got to go back to the better half of the first family of identity, Pam Dingle, when she said, look, we actually haven't solved anything. We are just now building the tools we need to go do something. She was, and continues to be, right about this, and mostly everything else. We actually struggle to solve the problems that identity presents. And I think it's partially because we struggle to apply identity to solve these things. We've been doing a lot of identity in a bit of a silo and not thinking about its application. Consider, nobody, except for people in these rooms, actually cares about signing in. Nobody actually cares about showing a picture that purports to be their driver's license. Nobody. What they do care about is what happens next. They care about the application of identity. And I want to walk through an exercise in thinking about how we can actually apply identity to affect real-world outcomes. And I want to do that through this concept of counselors. Because I actually believe that we are closer than ever to actually affecting real-world outcomes using identity. So the obvious first question is, what the hell are you talking about? It's a natural question. A counselor is a digital agent. It acts on your behalf. It makes suggestions about services to use, to avoid, and it essentially looks after your interests. It is an active client. By this I mean it's running on all of your devices, and it can actually step in before you share information in a risky manner. And along the way, it can create some pseudonymity. So I can say to my counselor, hey, I need to go to Berlin. Here's the dates. Go get me a plane ticket. And it won't go search and find choices. It has everything it needs to act autonomously and actually book that ticket. No, I'm leaving from Washington, D.C. I'm a Star Alliance flyer. I like a window seat. And so you can think about a counselor as something that uses your digital identity to get something done for you. And I've identified there are 6 components to actually building one of these things. And so let's start at the beginning. Something we're familiar with. In order for a counselor to act on one's behalf, it really is going to act as a persona. And that includes credentials associated with that persona. Now, the good news is we actually know how to store credentials, right? We have username and password stores in password managers in our browsers. Similarly, we have operating systems that can manage passkeys stored in TPMs. And one can imagine that as verified credentials become more of a thing, they too will be in the mix. But no one will have only username and passwords, or only passkeys, or only verified credentials. And I think this statement will be true for, I'm going to go on a limb and say 20 years. Come see me in 20 years in a nursing home and tell me if I was wrong or right. But here's the thing, because we're going to have a blend of these things, we're going to need some sort of broker. So this first component is just that. It's a credential broker that can understand within context what kind of credential to present, and even better, what kind of credential to create as you're using a new service, for example. But, and I know this following statement is controversial, life is more than just signing in. Right? Hold on. We remember this? Together? Life is more than just signing in. Very good. Because it's after I sign in that I've got to do something, correct? And to do that, I've got to present some form of information. Might be a shipping address, might be a form of payment, it could be a student ID. So I need a way of actually storing and presenting this information. Good news again. Our browsers, our password managers know how to form fill, and we know how to store digital payment and present those digital payments. And again, we have to consider that that's great. It works aggressively adequately. But there are higher assurance use cases that actually do require more verifiable data. Not all the time, but there are use cases. And so I have high hopes that verified credentials can actually present a standardized, or at least standardizable, format for storage of that information and presentation of that information. And if we don't get that, we always have a comma, right? We always have a CSV file. We can always form fill. So this data manager essentially becomes that way of storing and presenting information in order to get something actually done. And again, one can imagine as verified credentials come into the fore that it's part of the mix. So the next thing we need is to consider that we are in Las Vegas. And last night, some of you left the relative safety of the hotel and you went to, say, a pirate bar. And you thought on the way in when the Uber driver's like, are you sure? You thought maybe something's wrong. Maybe this is going to be a bad idea. This is a sense of real-world street smarts, right? And we have it all to varying degrees. But I would posit that that's less so digitally speaking. That's harder to come by. And so that's why, obviously, we need the nudge. The nudge. You know the nudge, right? So a nudge is someone who pesters. What we need is something that sort of can maybe constantly be with you, maybe looking over your shoulder and kind of like, no, don't do that. That's a bad idea. It's 3 a.m. and you really shouldn't be forking over the corp card. Really bad idea. Right? What we want to do is have something that essentially causes you to think before handing over information. Some sort of warning sign along the way that says, I don't know if that's a good idea. You know, the nice thing is, we actually already have this, kinda. Our browsers give us safe browsing information, right? So some sort of adornment or visual signal that this isn't quite right. It's a rudimentary form of street smarts. But we need to actually build that out, scale it out to not just websites, but services, even to APIs. And along the way, it would be really nice if we could actually generate some pseudonymity along the way, whether it's one-time payment tokens or it's identifiers. We have some of those things today. It's just not sort of well coordinated. So we have these three components. So far, we can do some stuff. But there's a critical piece missing. It's kind of a big deal. You know, like, under what conditions am I okay sharing information? Right? Obviously, that changes depending on the context. And similarly, I've got to understand, and the counselor has to understand, how is a service provider going to use that information once it is presented to it? Right? And so we've got to have, for me as a human, and the counselor on my behalf, I actually have to have both of these things. And so what I'm talking about is a resolver, something that can translate what the service provider says it's going to do with my information into a format I understand. This is taking privacy notices and humanizing them. And on the other side of the equation, something that can express what data I'm okay sharing and under what conditions. The problem, among many, is there are no standards here. This is a real issue. We cannot express how I'm okay using data. What I can store is a checkbox for consent. That is not the same thing. But again, we're closer than ever to building something that actually affect real-world outcomes. And this is a place where actually AI can step in, because it's really good about translating something into something else, turning privacy notices, which are fantastically digestible by lawyers, into something general population can understand, and understand when I'm okay using information and under what conditions. So this sort of component then has both sides of the equation. Information I'm okay with sharing, under what conditions, and then what are people going to do with that information? Arguably, you could add to this consent receipt and some other things, but these are the primary two components you need. We, however, are not done. Mostly because there's white space on the slide. That's a dead giveaway. There's more slides coming. So I've got to be able to interact with this thing. And that interaction has to be meaningful. It's got to be more than interacting with a child's toy, like a Teddy Ruxpin that knows like 10 phrases and has no sense of context. Right? This has to be a rich and robust interaction. And so again, this is where generative AI actually can play a pretty interesting role. Now, in order for these counselors to work and work globally, they've got to be multimodal. Right? They've got to be not only an interaction through audio, through visual, even touch, right? Because we have to serve a global population with these things. And they have to run everywhere. So what starts as a mobile device becomes a wearable device, becomes an implanted device, and there is good evidence that next week, or the week after, Apple is going to announce its AI models running fully locally on a device. And we're already seeing evidence that Windows may have had a false start with their, was it recall model or something, to do the same thing, right? The push to get generative AI closer to the edge is on, and that means that those models will continue to shrink so they can fit onto any form factor. And it's this interaction layer that lets me, well, go to my counselor and say, I need this plane ticket, go do it. So the interface layer is really the thing that gives counselor a voice in a way that I can interact with it, and so it can hide some of the complexities of like, what credentials do I need, and where do I store the data, and what data do I need to present? But as the white space indicates, there is one missing thing. This one's messy. This one's, frankly, scary. In order to be useful, like really useful, counselors have to observe us. They actually have to look at the way we use apps and sites, individual APIs. They've got to know what data we're okay sharing, and we've got to know what credentials to use. It's got to know what credentials to use in that process. There is a word for this. It is surveillance. But in order for something to act on our behalf, like really act on our behalf, like say a lawyer might do, it actually needs to study and learn from us. And we have to be okay with that. This is participatory surveillance. And it exists today, and we all benefit from it. You're like, bullshit. Let me show you. Consider your loved ones, your friends, your executive admin, if you're lucky enough to have one. They know what you like. They know what you don't like. They know you well enough to know when something's off. That's incredibly powerful. That is participatory surveillance. And we've got to figure out a way to bring that into the digital world. Now, clearly, if we're going to do that, there needs to be a metric crap ton of controls around that, right? Because we don't want to just sort of let this thing loose. The interesting thing is we already have this, kinda. Consider in mobile operating systems, for things like Apple Siri or Google Assistant, there are guardrails around what information and what apps these things can use and how they can use them. And so if we could scale that up, then we'd actually have a framework to manage participatory surveillance. And it's that capability that actually makes counselors really autonomous. Okay, so this exercise in applied identity starts with things we're familiar with, credentials, data associated with them. It moves towards things that we have maybe a little bit less familiarity with, but as professionals, but certainly as individuals, have a sense for what is digital street smarts and how do we actually relay that information to an individual. Being able then to understand clearly how services would use information that I share with it, and then what am I okay sharing based on what I have learned. And an interface layer that actually is robust, no matter the form factor, no matter the modality. But again, if we just stopped here, we have a sort of spiced up version of search. Because it doesn't have autonomy at this point. It doesn't have a sense of what are really my preferences. They're always inferred. And that's why we need participatory surveillance. I ran out of ideas here, and I also ran out of white space, so the two converged nicely. What we just went through was an exercise in applied identity. We start with a basic building block, something we're familiar with, credentials. And we recombine those things to actually build something that can achieve real-world outcomes. And that is far beyond just signing into stuff, because that was so weak. 2, 1. Life is more than just signing into stuff. Thank you. I know it's day 3, but keep up. Here's the thing. Using digital identities to actually achieve real-world outcomes is not just the interest of this sort of consumer-centric example. This exact same exercise can be done in a workforce context, a social services context, how we help the unbanked, how we use this in a humanitarian way. Now, to do this, this is way more than user account management, right? This is actual identity management. This is something we need to reach towards. I think the way we reach towards that is we actually think about the applications of identity to drive real-world outcomes. Because if we can actually drive real-world outcomes, then we can actually get something done after a couple of decades. Thank you, everybody.
So thanks to Ian's timing, we do have time for questions. If you raise your hand, I can bring the mic up to you.
You can also get a 5-minute nap. I won't tell anyone. Your call. Heads down, everybody.
Just go dark.
Justin, you don't need a mic.
Yeah, sure. So with this model, a lot of what we've seen for personal assistants ends up being sort of device bound.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do you think that we need to break free from that, or are we embracing the device is my?
No, we have to get beyond device is my sort of window.
Right.
If only because I truly believe, jokes aside, form factors are going to change. And knowing that I've got to have this $1,000 supercomputer that's roughly a rectangle at all times actually isn't a way to serve a global population. Part one. Part two is it's just inconvenient, right? But, and this is the thing I've thought about is, as the participatory surveillance manager actually observes what you do, where you share credentials, it's going to build up models. Fine. That means, if we're going to make this work across devices, that those models, the things it learns or it infers from them, has to be replicated. And I'm terrified of that part, because that part is the juicy target. If I can get that, then I can essentially build a evil counselor that imitates me. And basically just put a big not sign in front of, well, don't do anything that this thing says, right? Do the opposite of that. So we have to break out of this device-bound world for a variety of reasons. With that comes both this is a honeypot of information, and in a rising AI world, ability to literally replicate me digitally. And it also represents, I think, an enormous challenge around portability that we've not begun to think about. Like, I don't think as identity practitioners we've fully gotten into what does it mean when I have a smart retina that I actually have to authenticate to, or vice versa. Yes, it's IoT, but it's gone kind of crazy, right? So, like, yeah, there's a lot to it, but it has to be, let's be post-device about this.
Hey, thanks for these concepts, very interesting. Taking it a step further, I think for digital personas to be doing things on our behalf, I think the next thing has to be that it has to become socially acceptable that digital persona did something for me, because if my wife on her birthday gets flowers because my digital persona did it, I don't think she would be very happy. I don't know.
Statistically speaking, would you normally get her flowers on her birthday? This could go either way, my friend.
20 years of marriage, I probably have sent enough flowers, otherwise wouldn't be doing it.
Okay,
so,
good to know.
Yeah.
So it's not, you're absolutely right, and that doesn't go far enough. Yeah. It's not just that it has to be socially accepted, it actually has to be legally accepted. And we have to have understand about liability in this model. So one of the slide I had thanking the people that contributed to this, the first line was from Bob Blakely and Mike Neuenschwander, who wrote about limited liability personas, a concept they came up with mumble number of years ago, let's say 15 to 17 years ago, that posited the idea that as we become more digital entities, we actually need to think about and address the legal ramifications of that. And so as opposed to an LLC, which is a way of instantiating a corporation, could we do that digitally for a persona? So you're absolutely right, we got to go further than that.
How many counselors do I want in my life? And if it's more than one,
I don't actually know you, so it's going to be really hard to answer that question. No, so here's the thing about this. I sort of stumbled into this idea in 2019. And I was thinking about how, especially around the digital street smarts, that's actually a value add. And for some people, they want to be like, nope, I want to make all my own choices. And so they may have the sort of iOS provided, let's say, I'm not saying and Apple specifically, but they're going to find the OS specific, let's say, default counselor. But we could imagine social service entities, government, municipalities, others that create counselors that have different sort of data sets for things about what constitutes safe or not. One could imagine one for children, and that could be actually a value add in a marketplace for that. I think you only need one, because let's look at it this way. from a participatory surveillance perspective, we have a limited number of people that we let that close. Because it's kind of exhausting to maintain more of that. But like, practically speaking, we have a limited number of those things. So having a Tamagotchi that also is that, and then 2 more of those things, feels like too much. But then that raises question about portability. Right? So I think you'll have one that needs to be able to change over time. But I think there'll be a marketplace for them, or at least I hope so, or the information that can inform them, there should be a marketplace. Oh, we're up. Oh, well, thank you.